Welcome back to America's Commercial Real Estate Show. I am Michael Bull. Thank you for being with us. This segment is brought to you by BOMI.org. That's B-O-M-I. Check them out for facilities and property management training and courses, BOMI.org. Well, today we're talking about office tenant strategies, and we've heard from an architect and design gentleman about what's going on there. Well, now let's talk to a tenant rep who helps companies and has been doing it for a very long time. Please welcome Richard Rhodes. He's a principal with Cresa, and he works out of their Washington, D.C. office, and he's joining us on the phone again. Richard, good to talk to you again.
Thanks, Mike. It's nice to be back. Appreciate it.
So, Richard, what have you been doing this about 37 years now?
It's funny you ask. Yesterday was the end of my 34th year in representing tenants. Crazy.
That's great. So you think you're going to make it?
Make it where?
Well, Richard, you guys are helping a lot of tenants. You're seeing a lot of trends, and there seems to be a lot of changes going on in the way people and companies use office space. And I wanted to get from you kind of what you're seeing from your desk, kind of firsthand on trends. So, first of all, what are you seeing for square footage per employee and trends there? It seems like we've been packing them in. Is that changing? What do you see?
Yeah, I think it is changing. We went from the traditional look, which was office along the perimeter and even office on the interior, to the next iteration, which was open planning on the interior, to the next iteration, which was offices on the interior and open planning on the window. And I think as a result of the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, real estate took it on the chin, and that was one of the major expenses tenants were looking to reduce. So they did that by packing as many people as they could in as little space as they could. And they sold it as, a better culture, better communication, better collision opportunities. And I think that worked for a while. And you get the sense over the last years that it has begun to backfire. There's a loss of privacy. It's not necessarily a noise issue. I think people are generally courteous. But it is not what it was cracked up to be. It's too crowded, and there's not enough area for small meetings, large meetings, private phone calls, etc. So the trends we're seeing now is coming off of that highly dense space, which, by the way, got down as low as 150 feet per person or less, wow, to something in between where, yes, the systems furniture solution is still a good solution. I see many tenants who don't even go with private offices, but have a tremendous amount of huddle areas, small conference space, areas in an office where an individual can come in and work in 4 or 5 different locations if they wanted to. They may have an assigned seat, they may not, but even if they do, they may go work at a counter high top in the all-purpose room or pantry, if you will, a small booth. So tenants are designing their spaces to be completely flexible, allow people to come and go and work where they want easily. Yeah,
and that makes sense, and we're seeing the same thing. Now, when you talk about the trends were to cram people in, bench them almost to get them close together, less space, and now you're starting to see a change. And you think also of the timing. If you look back after the recession, unemployment was high. It was harder for people to get jobs and keep jobs. Now employment's tight, and people and companies are really concerned about recruiting and retention. So is that creating some of the trend towards more space per employee?
No, I think it is. I think it is. Yes. Somebody used to use the example that an attorney comes out of law school, and he knows he's going to get paid $75,000 no matter where he goes. So what's the sell point? The sell point often becomes the facility itself, the working environment. What are you giving this person that perhaps is different or at least equal to what he might or she might get somewhere else? So I do think that the working environment, and we talk to our clients all the time about, your space speaks for who you are. And the moment you walk in that suite entry, if it doesn't tell your story, you're missing an opportunity there on so many levels, not just recruiting.
Yeah, and it's some of that challenge when we're working with tenants and companies and trying to get them to understand how powerful their space can be for recruiting, for retention, for productivity, for image. When they're very cost conscious, when they really concentrate on the cost, is that part of the challenge to get them to think about it? Hey, your office space may cost you very little in the scheme of things if it increases your productivity.
Yeah, I think we want to be careful with costs, and maybe we'll talk about construction costs, but it's not necessarily cheaper to build a wide open space versus private offices, which is a bit of a misnomer. But I do think there's cost savings down the road because the more egalitarian the space is, the easier it is to handle things like advanced employees, promotions. You don't worry about moving someone into a bigger office. You don't have 6 sized offices or stations in the space. So you find other ways to reward, basically.
Yeah, and you mentioned rising construction costs. So what are you doing with clients, Richard, to sort of mitigate and manage the process? Because I'm sure you're seeing construction costs really rise.
Yeah, and I think there's 3 reasons, the typical reasons, which are high demand. So the subcontractors are busy. They don't have to take jobs, and if they do, they're going to charge you. Material costs have also risen for the same reason, demand. And then there's the federal government's recent tariffs on imports, et cetera, which is definitely having an impact already on construction costs and will going forward. It is very tricky now because, yes, you have higher tenant improvement allowance being offered to tenants in order for landlords to maintain their rental rates, but you're not necessarily going to be able to cover everything. We used to be able to cover construction costs, move costs, cabling, wiring, security, signage, all through free rent and tenant improvement allowance. I think in many, many cases you can still do that, but sometimes now we're using the landlord as a bank to amortize additional costs, or we're using the tenant's financial options to amortize additional costs. We're running into that period now that I remember, if you remember, we were getting all our drywall from China many years ago, and that price skyrocketed. And the result was tenants didn't move as much. They ended up renegotiating and staying in their space. We could be entering that similar condition over the next year or two.
Well, that's interesting, and I guess for existing landlords, that is good news. So what are some other trends you see kind of forming right now for the way people use office space or negotiate or build out spaces?
I think we covered a lot of it. I just think flexibility is key. I think, tenants fall down on both sides of the line as to whether or not they're in favor of hoteling or not. That is still, this discussion's been going on for 30 years. Is it a good thing or not to save space but lose the synergies that come with being together? That's unresolved. I think most of my clients would like to see people in their space, so they solve that problem by creating flexible work schedules that aren't quite as extreme as hoteling, or flexible office space, as we talked about before, giving the people the option to work where they want. By the way, the key to that is technology. So if you're going to spend your money anywhere, you have to be at the highest level of technology to offer the greatest level of flexibility within your space. So that, you might call that a trend. And the other trend, of course, is the office furniture companies who are trying to keep up with changing demands, or in many cases, they lead the way. The other trend is you don't see 6 and 8 foot workstations or desks anymore. They're 4 and 5 feet because they're so compact and the storage is built in and things are just more efficient around you within reaching distance. So, I'd say furniture and technology, as they always have, but maybe more so today, are playing a major role in trends, if you would.
Right, and furniture and technology can really create a lot more flexibility for you, right? So when you need to change offices, sometimes if you're using furniture, that's a lot easier way to do it. So before you go, I'd like you to share with our audience maybe the top 2 or 3 mistakes that tenants should make sure they avoid when they're renewing a lease or looking for new space.
Yeah. So, and you and I have talked about this in the past, and my attitude has not changed. I think the biggest mistake tenants make is they undervalue negotiating flexibility. Everybody's always focused on bottom line. Sometimes, and I like to empty all the buckets, of course, as a tenant rep, but even if I have to pay a touch more to get a termination option or a contraction option or an expansion option or even a renewal option, which, you don't use a lot, you typically renegotiate. These are critical points in a negotiation. It is so challenging, especially in today's world of rising construction costs, to get enough money or enough concession to cover relocation without doing, forget a 10-year deal these days, 11, 12, 13, 15-year deals now. So great, you can keep your rent stabilized, you can maximize your concession package, but you're stuck unless you have these flexibility clauses. And if you're of a significant size, and I'll call that one floor or greater, you should be able to get multiple options in your lease, especially these long-term deals. So that's the biggest mistake I see tenants make, is we'll go in and we'll see, oh my goodness, they're locked in for 12 years, they have no out, they have no right to contract, they have no expansion capabilities. That's an oversight.
Yeah, that's a good point. But some of those rights can be very expensive, right? But if you have, at least you have the option there, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, look, you have the right to sublease, you have the lease expiring, you have a right to terminate. By the way, we use the termination option all the time to leverage a renegotiating. The event the tenant's rent has gone over market, the landlord doesn't want to lose the tenant has to look at other options, and perhaps staying is the right move. Well, they have the right to get out and leave unless the landlord wants to adjust to market. So there are lots of ways to use these options. Options are, by definition, one way, so they have economic value. I mean, we've traded signage options for cash before because we had a right to signage. Turned out we didn't need. So landlord bought it back from us for 6 figures. I mean, there are opportunities out there. You want to empty those buckets if they're available to you.
Yeah, that's a good point. One more final question for you, Richard, before you go, and that's about timing. So give me an idea of what companies should think about as far as how far out in advance should they get out and start planning for a move or renewal.
Yeah, a lot of it is driven by size. But again, I'll use the full floor example for now. Working backwards, if you're moving and you need to do build out, and let's assume it's from a shell or from a space that has to be substantially gutted, you need 90 to 120 days to build. In most markets, you need somewhere between 3 weeks and 8 weeks for permits. You need between 6 weeks and 8 weeks to do drawings. These days, leases are taking 2 to 3 months to negotiate. So I don't know what I have there, but I'm thinking that's 10 or 11 months right there. And then we have to do our job, which is locating space, negotiating proposals, running cash flow analysis, perhaps getting internal board approvals. That could be another 9 or 10 months. So I like 22 months to 24 months. If you are a large user that has the capability of kicking off a building or having a building built for you, I would extend that by another year. So you want to get started probably 3 years out. It is better to have too much time than too little time. I would much rather be chased than be the chaser. You do not want your back up against the wall with a lease coming up.
Very good point. Very good point. And I guess you also want to think about not just the time that maybe your current lease expires, but maybe from the time that you have to give notice if you're going to renew.
Yep, that's the trigger, right? Yeah. Everything has to be done by then. Otherwise, the landlord knows it's too late for you. Your current landlord knows he pretty much has you.
That's right. Well, Richard, good information as usual. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Thanks, Michael. Always a pleasure.
All right. Well, thank you, Richard. Great information. And stay with us. We're going to have more. We're going to have another professional and get his view on office tenant strategy. Stay with us. I'm Michael Bull. This is America's Commercial Real Estate Show.